All right. Great to be with everybody. Thanks for joining. Glad to have Zain with us today and to be with everybody for Ethereum's History and State. We're in week 2 of Kernel, which technically means module 1, week 1, given we offset. We had Bitcoin as week 0, and we're now onto Ethereum's History and State in week 1. I want to do for Zain a bit of an overview. Zain was with us in KB5, so he knows a bit about Kernel, but just so everyone is on the same page. It's just a great group here in KB9, as we are grateful to have been true for really every block. Lots of people building at the earliest stages, lots of people building on chain, um, lots of people building on optimism and on base. Um, the people that are in the room are interested in the history and future of the web, and most specifically in the decentralized web, and come from backgrounds all over the world of software, finance, art, and much, much beyond. So we'll have hopefully a lot more voices in the room than myself and Zane's. We're going to try to get into the discussion and, as always, make Fireside collaborative. The more voices in the room, the better. So please put your questions in the chat. Let us know what you're thinking. Let us know what you're excited about hearing more about, and the conversation will flow in those directions. Week 1 is on Ethereum's history and state, and the two guiding modules are on meaning and value. Value is the piece that feels like we may get furthest into with Zain today. To poke at it, week 0 of Kernel was about truth. Of course, Bitcoin foundationally being a place where truth and trust are kind of the topics that start the story. The idea that we can trust a decentralized network of computers to agree on a shared state such that we can believe the story of the transactions that are going on the shared record is kind of like one way to talk about Bitcoin, and it's the way that we typically talk about it in kernel. And we explore it not only um, through Ethereum and Bitcoin, but today we'll explore it through optimism and some of the other shared records that have come over time. But the key quote that I want to start with value is this idea that trust in clearly shared truths lies at the core of how we might generate valuable interactions between people. Trust in clearly shared truths lies at the core of how we might generate valuable interactions between people. Um, and when we talk about something like interoperability, which is really the topic of the day, as it relates to Ethereum's history and state, we'll have Zain kind of talk about the system. Like, what is the system that's being created there so that it's a clear system where we know what the actors in the system are, we know what their roles are, and how any types of deception in a decentralized system can be accounted for, and incentivized against, so that we can trust that system and we can get more focused about just trusting each other to generate valuable transactions. This is really the longer arc story of Ethereum, is that we're moving from having to trust platforms to being able to go back to trusting people. Um, and what I want to do really quickly is kind of go through a history of Ethereum. Um, this was done with help of GPT this morning, with lots of guiding questions to try to get to the more specific things that have been meaningful in the history of Ethereum. But we started this module, if we go back to, okay, like what's actually in the syllabus, you have meaning and value, as mentioned, for Ethereum's history and state. You then have an early Nick Szabo article written in actually 2002, so predates Bitcoin, but Szabo is very possibly a part of the people that were Satoshi and he is talking a lot about seals and clay seals and how clay seals were a big part of verifiability well before the internet. The need for seals in money systems is kind of well documented, but it was a really interesting reminder and kind of like analog version of what it is that now is happening on blockchains. You have these receipts, tokens sealed in envelopes. When you have an owner that was hungry, you would take an envelope to the warehouse. The claimant and the warehouse operator would inspect the seal, break it, inspect the tokens, and then deliver the goods. So this was the system before we had computers and the likes. And the way that we then introduced Ethereum is as really a really old idea dressed up in new clothes. So instead of operating as a network based on clay seals, we have these encoded light networks that we're using called computers these days. And this talk is from really the earliest days of Ethereum. It's when Vitalik is first explaining the idea. He might be 19 or 20 years old in London at DEF CON 1. And that is kind of pretty much when the story begins. If you look a little closer, it was really 2014 where people are talking about it. There's this post that also is kind of in the syllabus where it's by a man named Ria Myers, who is an artist and was around at the earliest days of Ethereum, and he was talking about Art World Ethereum um, and the planned 2014 release date of Ethereum. But as the timeline goes, we'll just go quickly and try to get into what comes next. But in 2015, the Frontier Network launches. You have Vitalik, Gavin Wood, Joe Lubin, and many others around at the time. In March 2016, you have the first production release of Ethereum, the DAO hack occurring not too long thereafter, which leads to one of the early intense moments for the network that the network does get through with a fork of Ethereum from the main chain and then Ethereum Classic. But Ethereum itself continues. 2017, you have the first time the market cap is surpassing $1 billion. You have the earliest kind of like Ethereum hackathons. ETH Global starts at that time, which is also kind of tied into optimism with a lot of the early optimism folks being involved with the ETH Global hackathons. CryptoKitties, which Brian Watson's on the call today at Perma. And I hope, Brian, we get to jam with you at some point in the call. But CryptoKitties launches, highly popular game. It really starts to point at the first application that like is like, oh wow, this Ethereum thing probably needs to scale because gas fees are getting into the tens and twenties and hundreds of dollars just for people to try to buy these CryptoKitties. And that was 2017. We're now, it's crazy in 2024. And those types of gas issues are no longer really as relevant as of the last few years, although they can still get better. 2018, MakerDAO launches DAI. SEC declares that Ethereum is not a security. 2019, Uniswap launches significant traction from an Ethereum Foundation grant project to what it is today. Istanbul hard fork gets implemented. DeFi is at $600 million. By 2020, the Beacon chain launches, which is the shift towards Ethereum 2.0 and proof of stake. You have DeFi Summer from $600 million in December in 2019. You have $9 billion in DeFi in 2020. 500,000 ETH staked for the launch of Ethereum 2.0 in 2020. It's not all rosy. You have the first lawsuit against Ripple in 2020, which is still probably the biggest legal case in the history of crypto. Goes until late last year and still has some ripple effects, no pun intended. But we then have 2021, the NFT boom, major sales like Beeple's $69 million auction. There's all sorts of other things that we can talk about that happened in 2021. But what we want to focus on is 2022. You have the launch of Optimism, one of the first layer two scaling solutions, improving transaction throughput, reducing gas fees. You have the merge in September 2022, transition from proof of work to proof of stake, which is something that, if you look back on something like Vitalik's blog, has been written about as early as 2015. So about 7 years in the making. And then, yeah, you do have the FTX collapse and some of the negative things that were happening at the end of 2022, and kind of like a really quiet period of building from 2022 to 2024. Um, I kind of want to pause here and introduce Zain, who is a dear friend and somebody who has been with us in Kernel since Kernel Block 5. He's a fellow in KB5. Around that time is when he joined Optimism. I want to tell the story of how he got involved and how he got interested in Optimism, and a bit more, perhaps, Zain, about these last 2 years from a more personal perspective. I kind of did the big broad overview for, you know, 2017 to 2022. For you, I think these are the 2 years that you've started to really, I think, make a name for yourself in the space, and also have seen a lot of stuff. And I recognize that your perspective will be perhaps a bit more narrow, but you've also done a good job paying attention to a lot of things. So hearing about 2022 to 2024 from you and how your story in crypto began may be a good place to start. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for the kind welcome. One minor correction, Optimism mainnet actually launched in 2021. 2022 is like when the governance token and some other initiatives started to really take off. Um, yes, you got to double check with Claude and Grok and a few others, but all good. Howdy, everyone. So grateful to get to chat with everyone again. Just a little bit of context around how I got to crypto. It was actually via Vivek and Mark Balin. I was hosting them for a Thanksgiving dinner during the pandemic, and I had previously like played around with Ethereum more in the speculative context. But over dinner, Mark and Vivek were telling me about everything being built on Ethereum. And I remember, I think it was back in 2016, I was reading about what could be built on Ethereum, but I'd never like used a smart contract, anything like that. And after that conversation, like I seeing the passion in Vivek and Mark's eyes, went on chain using some of like the early Nansen tools, and I was dumbfounded. Like looking at the variety of contract calls being happening, the amount of value being moved from address to address. And then when I really like started to dig in, for some reason, I was infatuated with Sushi Swap. Um, I was noticing, majority of the traders, right? And at the time, I thought an address was equivalent to an individual person, but majority of these traders were actually losing money, right? And so when I was looking into why this was happening, right, a few hypotheses came up. Maybe the trader didn't really understand foreign exchange fees, right? For example, going from ETH to Sushi X and so on and so forth, that there is a slippage when the user transacts on that. And then the other piece was it was actually transaction fees, right? So gas wasn't in the hundreds of dollars at that point in time, but on, a $10, $20 trade, $3, $5 in fees would eat into the trader's profitability. And so I was kind of confused at that point in time. Mark and Vivek had talked to me around how crypto had the opportunity to democratize finance, to bring in more people, right, who are unbanked. And yet we were penalizing, or from my perspective, it looked like we were penalizing some of the smallest traders, right? So I was like, why is there this dissonance? So went down the proverbial rabbit hole as people do to really understand, well, why are fees high, right? Why is block space constrained? And that led me to really understand Ethereum scaling strategy with rollups, as well as looking at alternative solutions, specifically Solana. So at the time, was working on newsfeed ranking at Facebook and decided to start contributing on a Solana liquid staking protocol. Reason being was, well, I wanted to have a big impact, and Ethereum felt kind of crowded at that moment in time, right? And Solana was still being developed, and it was trying to solve for the high fees in a slightly different approach. And I ended up working so much on the Solana protocol, waking up at 5 a.m., working until 9 a.m. doing my normal job until 7, and then working 7 to midnight on the Solana protocol. That I said, okay, maybe I should do this full time. Um, so talked to Vivek, interviewed at a variety of different companies, some at the infrastructure layer, some at the application layer. But the reason optimism stood out for me specifically was kind of going back to that conversation I had with Vivek and Mark, where it was a lot around, hey, we want to solve a very specific problem, which is Ethereum scaling, but we want to do it in a way that is creating something novel and redefining how capitalism is formed, kind of alluded to with the context of retroactive public goods funding, where it's saying, hey, we're going to be producing so much economic activity. How do we allocate that in a way that is beneficial for all of the participants? And that idea, right, around solving for a specific user problem, high fees, right, scaling, decentralized compute access, and then also trying to solve for something very specific to the founders, where they were a research group, right? Their code got forked. They never received any economic benefit from it. It seemed like a great opportunity. So decided to leave Facebook and join Optimism in early 2022. I'll pause there. So that is how I got into crypto, the start of the Optimism journey. So very grateful for Kernel. Yes, I'll answer that for Kernel as well, to navigate me through that journey, because I remember KB5 was going on at that similar time. And then Grace, to your question, why did I leave Solana for Optimism? I think it comes back to a few things. One is ethos. Like, look, I'm incredibly grateful for the teams working on Solana, right? Both at the application and infrastructure layer. I think they helped me think sharper. But I think like the ethos of giving back to public goods, trying to create a new economic system, I see that in Gitcoin, I see that in Kernel, and I saw that at Optimism. I didn't really see that so much with the teams I was interacting with on Solana. So it came down to effectively that, right? Where both teams had good market positions, but it was just which team I was more excited about, which teams felt a little bit more visionary.
Zane, this is great, and it gets us to like that moment in 2022, and perhaps it gives us really good space to start with, okay, well, what's been going on? Because 2022 to 2024, there are the big things I can kind of like point to. Obviously, one of the most obvious ones is Base. Base launches. There are the retro PGF rounds that have happened over time. There is the fact that on a practical note, when I interact with blockchains now, I know that there's an easy way for me to do so at less than a cent, or around a cent in gas fees, at any moment of any day, as long as I can get people to deal with getting onto a bridge and getting onto an L2 with me. But it's a normal part of my time using blockchains now is at the like sub $1 fees, which means that in the story that you're telling of like when you began, that hopefully for most is an avoidable problem, even if it's a bit of a nuisance still sometimes. But what what have you seen broadly on this like Ethereum's state story before we get into the cutting edge of something like interoperability? It's like really,
Yeah, amazing. So actually, we didn't even have subset or less than $1 fees back in January 2022, right? So it all comes back to scaling, and just something to keep in mind for everyone. We have objective data, right, from Solana, from Ethereum. When you lower fees, you increase economic activity, right? So more people come on chain, there's more activity on chain, right? And we've seen that specifically with Optimism and other scaling solutions as well. Now, in 2022, January timeframe, I think if you were going to do like a swap on an L2, like an Arbitrum or an Optimism, you're probably going to be paying 50 cents to a dollar in fees, right? Most of that was to L1 actually, right? When you compare to alternative scaling solutions like the Avalanches, the Solanas, et cetera, end users were paying less than a cent in fees, right? So then there was a little bit of tension around that January 2022 point where it was saying, well, why should we use Ethereum scaling solutions when they're 10, 20, 30x more expensive than these alt L1s that are innovating in their own respect, right? And Optimism specifically, we made two significant upgrades over the last 2 years that really brought down fees to what they are today, which are subset in some cases and competitive with the Solanas now. The first one was the Bedrock upgrade, which brought us even more equivalent with Ethereum's architecture and dropped gas fees, I think around 20 to 50% at that point in time, and made Optimism one of the cheapest rollups in Ethereum. The second was 4844, which required a lot of work between base core contributors, Optimism core contributors, and L1 devs. And that's where we saw the significant drop in transaction fees from those 20 cents all the way down to subset in some cases. And then looking forward, and I won't talk too much on that, there's two ways to bring fees down even further and just create even more economic access to people around the world. The first is vertical scaling. So within a single layer two, right, there's still finite block space, but you can increase the amount of transactions that you're pushing through by increasing the gas limit. That is what Base and other chains in the superchain are experimenting with on right now. And then the other, at a certain point, right, you can't increase the gas limit too much because the hardware requirements to run that chain are going to be too significant, right? The other piece that you can do, though, is you can horizontally scale, and that is what the superchain is. So effectively, right, our founders at Optimism, they said, okay, we're seeing applications like World Chain come online, right? They're hitting a certain amount of compute usage where a single layer two, right, is not going to be sufficient for their needs, right? You're going to have internet scale applications that are going to need multiple layer twos working simultaneously, right, in order to provide the amount of decentralized compute that is needed for these applications. And that is where the concept of the superchain came about. So that is why Base and Mode and Lisk and OP Mainnet are working together to create the superchain where instead of replicating state, which is the current paradigm where you take one application, you kind of copy and paste it on every single chain, you change smart contract development where it says, okay, I have 10 different L2s I can provision block space from. And how do I redesign my smart contract and build it in a way where the trade or the transaction is executed on the cheapest path? So if you're familiar for auto scaling, it's effectively very similar to that concept. I'll pause there, but that is how we got from 2022, where transactions were between 50 cents to $1, all the way down to today, where transactions are around a cent, and our path towards getting transactions to drive down even lower.
Fantastic. Okay, so now we got some stuff in the chat. So let me see, perhaps if Grace or Kashani would like, we could talk about your experiences with bridging, because I think that's where Zain is most heavily focused, but maybe Kashani or Grace, if you'd like, more voices the better. And Fireside, please let us know what your experiences have been bridging wise, and what you're hopeful for there. I think is something that would be meaningful for the next part of the convo.
Yeah, I can speak about that. So I'm chain agnostic, and I've written more than 100 white papers, and I work with a lot of people. And so I want to be able to support different chains. And it's just a nightmare. Like, you don't know how many wallets you've got. You don't know what bridge you're going to use. And then there's always some little, like, I've got one wallet somewhere. I know there's like a little money in like the Polygon network and some wallet that I forgot. I know where the seed keys are, but like I have to dig it out, and like yeah, right. It's funny, except there's a lot of money going into bridging chains. I don't even want to talk about that Gitcoin round when they tried to create their own token. And it was like, oh my God, that's when, by the way, all the Gitcoin people blocked me on their Twitter for being too critical of it. And nobody gave me customer support, right? And I'm pretty OG, right? Like, I'm having a nightmare story with all of the different layer twos. And every time I go to a conference, like I was at the EthCC, right? And I like get to some booth and they're like, okay, we're giving you this free whatever, they had a sweatshirt or something, and it was like, all you got to do is put 5 USDT on our whatever L2 and download our wallet. And I'm like, yeah, thanks, right? And how many 5 USDTs do you have that are just somewhere, right? And that's the industry today.
Yeah,
Kashani, if
that
we could hear from you as well, Kashani, if you'd like.
Oh, yeah. No, I was just gonna say that like the first time I bridged off base, I clicked the thing saying yes, bridge, and it took 7 days. So even if you're like trying to, you want to make a move, like, oh, I want to buy this coin, well, then it's like it can be too late. So that's a hindrance. But I did end up using Change Now, which I think has been really, really cool too. But yeah, it's just like there's a lot of roadblocks, and even most especially, like I've been in the crypto space for the past year, but still consider myself so beginner and learning. But just other people that are in my group that are onboarding, it's just like the chat's just insane because it's very, very confusing, and people trying to bridge, and it's just, yeah, it feels like there's so many different ways to do it. There's not like one just like simple solution. It's like, I think that's part of the crypto journey too, is that like you absolutely run into a million roadblocks.
Yeah, 100%. So
By the way,
let's
just one thing, like, and I'm not going to say that the amount that I've lost is more than I got in the optimism drop. So I'm very happy. Love optimism. Love you. Thank you so much. I bought a car. It's great.
Amazing. So just to tie some connections together, right? So we talked about horizontal scaling, right? The need for decentralized compute caused many L2s. And as Grace alluded to, right? All these L2s are creating a UX headache, right? High fees, high latency. I have USDT on X chain and it's not fungible with my USDT on Y chain. What are we doing here, right? So that's happening with Ethereum. And then on the other side, when you look at integrated solutions like the Solanas, right, there is not that DevX or UX headache, right? If I'm building on Solana, I'm just building on Solana. It's very clear. So there's some competitive dynamic that is starting to emerge between modular scaling solutions like Ethereum and integrated scaling solutions like Solana, right? So how do we solve this on the Ethereum side? And I'll talk a little bit around intents as well here. So the superchain, what we're focused on solving is effectively, Grace, what you just alluded to. When we launch in Q1, and we'll start pushing out comms around this, all of the chains in the superchain, right? We're not solving for horizontal scaling immediately, right? We're solving for this pain point of, I have X asset, I have USDT on chain A, I want to move it over to chain B. How do I do that? We are solving for that. So we are creating the plumbing where in 2 seconds, a message or an asset, and I focus on assets because 95% of cross-chain messages today are asset movement between chains, can be moved from chain A to chain B. And we're taking it a step further. We're saying we're going to be working with application developers to say, hey, instead of thinking about having to bridge, how do you handle a world where bridging is abstracted from the end user? So when you go to Uniswap and let's say you want to buy XYZ token on Zora, but you only have funds on Base, how do we make that an experience where you don't have to go to another application to go bridge over, wait X amount of days, pay 25 bips, but make it so that swap happens seamlessly with the balance that you want to use on your specific chain. So that is what we're bringing to market, and that is our core focus on a step towards horizontally scaling the super chain as well. Now, then there's a question around how do we think about, the super chain is just one ecosystem. How do we think about moving assets between Arbitrum and Polygon's ecosystem as well, right? Because we know application developers, they're going to want to be supporting networks where there are access to users. So we're taking the learnings from when Optimism originally launched, and we're working with third parties like the Acrosses, like the Layer Zeros, like the Hyperlanes, so that there is a standard interface that works across all of the EVM chains that an application developer can choose from. And then when the application developer, or the end user rather, is interacting with superchain specific routes, like OP mainnet to mode, for example, what the user experience is going to be is much faster than cheaper than hypothetically the user going between Arbitrum and Optimism. What that means, right, is a few things. At the application developer layer, they're getting a standard interface that works across all Ethereum L2s. From the user perspective, what they're getting is low latency, so sub 2 second, and low fees asset movement, and ultimately abstracting bridging from the concept of bridging from the end user. I'll pause there. So to summarize, right, the reason we're in this situation of a fragmented usability is because there's a proliferation of L2s and a proliferation of block space. That is net good for the long term, but we need to solve for this usability issue. The way that we're solving for this usability issue is creating an underlying protocol that allows for data to be shared between L2s so that they don't have to go back to L1. And the way that we're getting that protocol integrated into applications is by using standard interfaces, by working with key ecosystem partners like the Acrosses, et cetera, to provide a solution that works across all Ethereum L2s. The ultimate goal is that this concept of bridging, assets not being fungible, can be abstracted from the end user. Okay, I've said a lot there. There's one more thing I want to say, because I think someone brought up around intents. Okay, there's this, let's take USDC, because that's one of my favorite examples to use. If y'all have used Base or Optimism Mainnet or Arbitrum, you know that there's a concept of bridged USDC and native USDC. Bridged USDC, what that means is that USDC was minted by the canonical bridge via a deposit from L1 Ethereum. So user takes native USDC on Ethereum L1, deposits it into XYZ bridge, and on the L2, bridged USDC is created. There's that. And then there's also native USDC, which is natively minted on an L2 or another network like Noble in the Cosmos ecosystem. Now, as a user, right, as Zain, the user, not the contributor at OP Labs, those things are the same, right? To me, right? I can effectively redeem them for $1. But at the protocol layer, right, they're not the same. Some protocols integrate native USDC, some protocols integrate bridge USDC. It's a headache, right? And I get confused. So because those two tokens have different security models, one is minted by CCTP, which is Circle's technology. One is minted by the specific bridge. How do we make this fungible? And that is where things like intents kind of solve for this fragmentation. An intent, I think Paradigm has some great articles on this. ERC 7683 is also a way to standardize across intents, but an intent effectively puts that complexity not on the end user, but on specialists like solvers, market makers. So let's go back to the example of, I have bridged USDC on Zora, and I just want to go to Base that has native USDC. What happens is I pass my bridge USDC to a solver contract or a settlement contract. In 2 seconds, native USDC on Base is issued to my address, and then I go on and do whatever I need to do, right? In the background, through a rebalancing process, using CCTP, using native bridges, using interop, sometimes even using centralized exchanges, the solver contract rebalances their portfolio. What that means is that the end user can get their required asset within 2 seconds, low fees, and that complexity of managing, different messaging protocols is pushed off to specialists. So I do believe things like cross-chain intents are going to be super important as we think about abstracting some of these pain points that we've talked about this far.
Yeah.
I'll pause there.
You're doing great, Zain. Yeah, Zaremba was the one who asked about intents and has their hand raised, so please.
Thank you. Yes, so intent is something that I learned about only very recently, and I was trying to figure out what the hell is intent in terms of like intent-centric architecture, and I was reading those definitions, and I was reading, I made some notes, and when I was making a note of the quote, this, and I'll read that, this form of architecture greatly simplifies the user experience threshold so that each user only need to express their own intentions. The intermediate process is handed over to a variety of other agreements waiting for the final result. So this is just this super way around saying that it's the intent-centric, so like the architecture that is more user-friendly. There's it's so weird that for that there needs to be so many words instead of just saying we want a little bit less crappy architecture. I understand that it is in a very specific concept, in a very specific sort of use, so it's not general, but it's so weird to read that the idea of providing solutions that users just can say what they want and don't have to necessarily understand all of the path, every chain that they need. Like, this is just what everything should be when it deals with sort of retail users. It's so weird that it has to be written with so many words, and it's weird that
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
new.
100%. And I don't think, you know, as a user, you shouldn't have to think about, you know, what flavor of USDC you have, or what, if you're using an intent protocol underneath the hood. I think our job as, I think I'm talking over someone.
Go ahead, Zain. Go ahead.
Okay. Our jobs, right, is to help application developers. That is where the integration point is. As end users, right? Where do I experience this concept of pain, right? Is at the application layer. How do we help application developers abstract and solve for these common user problems, right? So when I go and use Friendtech or Forecaster, I don't have to think about, am I using an intent-based protocol? How do I bridge my ETH over? How do I have gas, etc.? It's addressed, right? But the underlying primitives, we have to align on what we want to do to address those user problems. And there's multiple different solutions with different trade-offs, right? An intent-based one is just one solution to solve for this user problem that we're talking about here.
I want to call this out, like the whole history of it, right? It's like, okay, well, we thought Ethereum would be one thing in 2016, 2017, 2018. At some point, it became very, very clear that these gas fees are going to get out of hand. It was really 2017. By that point, you could tell, like, CryptoKitties was running this network into the ground, so we weren't going to be able to keep this thing rolling. So then, like, another solution and another solution, and I recognize that this conversation is getting like really, really into it, into the weeds uh, of all of the different possibilities and all of the different protocols. And what I've always appreciated about Zane's work is, like, he's always very interested in, like, remove all that for the people. But I'm going to get involved, and I'm going to figure it out to the best of my knowledge. And he's gone from being, you know, with maybe a smaller group at Optimism doing specific product work to really trying to push this interoperability effort with 20 plus people at this point. And it seems like it's one of the top priorities of the whole project. Is if this part isn't solved and isn't completely clear and no one has to think about it but us, then we've failed. It seems to be the feeling that I get from Zain. Is that something that you would agree with?
Yeah, 100%, right? So to go to Val's comment, right, in the channel, right? We know we need good design, but it's like, how do we create the primitives to make that happen, right? So both at like the protocol layer, right? Because right now, if you try and do this, it's very expensive, and it takes a long time. It's a bad user experience, right? So how do we create the primitives to allow the designers, the application developers to solve for this, right? And it is a core focus for us because the way we see Ethereum scaling to millions and billions of people is through multiple L2s. And it's existential that we solve this. So it is a key focus for us to address this.
Yeah. I see
Can I just mention one more thing?
Yeah, sure.
I'm curious. I'm with one eye. I'm looking at the chat and I'm not reading fully. But I think Grace was mentioning something about refactoring, that we are in this specific architecture. Architecture is a bad word. There's so many. Well, blockchains generally are immutable, so you cannot just roll back some of the parts that are the most difficult. And I guess the reason why the intent-based or intent-centric architecture sounds so funny and so ironic is because to be able to get to something simpler, it's not possible to just very easily get rid of the parts that are making things more complicated. So it's like putting plasters around so many difficult things. And I imagine, and I'm curious, what do you think about that? If for example there's more solutions that are this intent centric, and for example our omni-chain, and people start using those because they're more they're easier to deal with, that might result with maybe some totally new chains becoming suddenly more popular because maybe they'll be so much easier that everything else will suddenly be like huge dinosaurs. So the future is potentially refactoring in this sense, so sort of like under the hood of some sort of like I'll keep using the intent-centric label because that's probably the best to call it, but something that is chain agnostic.
Yeah, I think that's the beauty of how Vivek started this Fireside, starting with the history of Ethereum and even before Bitcoin, right? So Ethereum had the opportunity to learn from Bitcoin and iterated accordingly. Newer alt L1s like Solana had the opportunity to learn from Ethereum and iterated accordingly. And to your point, right, there are property rights associated with Ethereum's current state. And let's say I minted something, why would I allow anyone to kind of change that, right, without my consent? So we do in Ethereum have to solve for this. And I think also as well, we have to solve for it in the context wherein developers have a choice right now, right? They can go to an integrated L1 like a Solana that has certain trade-offs, or they could pick an L2 or even L1 Ethereum to build on. But it is our job to kind of iterate quickly and solve for the user pains that are coming up in its current architecture. But I think at the end of the day, right, it's traditional software development. You ship, right, based on your best understanding of the user problem, and then you iterate. And I think that is the beauty of crypto broadly, whether you're on Solana or the Ethereum side, is that everyone is focused on iterating to bring these technologies to internet scale.
We have 13 minutes left with Zain, just calling it out. Justin, would you like to ask? And then Val, we can kind of continue with the rapid fire, but thank you, Zain, for getting us here. Justin would love to hear from you, and then Val, if you'd like, and anyone else.
I feel like my question may be off, but also I feel like, well, Zain, your swagger and your mustache are really on point, man. I really appreciate the way you come about. It's just such a good energy. I don't know. I understand like 62.35% of what's happening in this conversation, but I feel like I'm learning and I feel very like motivated and energized to be able to that like people are trying to do good work to create deeper connection between desperate systems in very right ways for very right reasons. And that's like a lot of hope and just I feel really good in that. So I was like, that's kind of superficial, but I just wanted to name that. I wondered, I guess a question I wondered about, like, I was a part of the seeds ecosystem for a long time. So, we kind of like there's like a regenerative economics cryptocurrency that was trying to create local economies and then scale them connected to like a global network of well, I guess kind of a global ecosystem using the Telos and EOS blockchain. And because Telos and EOS is energy efficient, it was kind of this more green energy based movement, but also kind of like narrow scope and not super effective for a lot of things to be able to do. And my wondering was something like, with all, there is so much data and value, and we have like spreadsheets of all the different transactions and who did what and tokenomics, and all of it feels lost. Like there's no value to that whole ecosystem. Everyone was a part of it because the currency kind of fell flat. Are there ways that you recognize that people can kind of reinvigorate dead or dying ecosystems when there's still a lot of value rich, I guess, tokenomics or token holders that are there? I don't know if my question makes sense or not, but I wonder about the revitalizing of cryptocurrencies that have kind of fallen to the wayside, to bring more vigor to token holders, but also maybe into these systems that are kind of finding new ways to find interoperability or connection at this time.
Yeah, great question. I think let's start at the user problem first. Like, is there a reason for a user to be transacting on XYZ chain? If there's not, then maybe it doesn't make sense, right, to revitalize. But if that ecosystem or that chain is producing value, then absolutely. And I'll give you a case example here. Celo is a mobile-first blockchain. They used to be an L1, and they're transitioning to be an L2 as part of the super chain, right? It's to really create idea, like at the protocol layer. I think your primary key, or excuse me, your ID is your phone number, right? So you're able to send XYZ token just via your phone number, and it's super cool, right? So there is an immediate value there, and there's focus on solving the payment use case, right? In terms of revitalizing their ecosystem, I think they noticed, hey, it's hard to bring people on. How do we improve accessibility to this? And they found that changing their architecture, being able to tap into the superchain's liquidity and user base made a ton of sense for them strategically. So I think that's an example that we see on the superchain side. And then coming back to Solana, sorry, those are the major ecosystems I know, right? There's Helium, which is a DePIN network, right? It's like physical infrastructure for sharing Wi-Fi among participants in like a local community, right? They were running their own L1, and they said, okay, similarly, we want people to use this network, but we're spending XYZ portion of our time not focus on developing this DePIN network, but on maintaining the L1. So in order to revitalize our ecosystem and really focus on our core product, we're going to move the network onto Solana, right? And that migration happens seamlessly, and they're seeing a ton of success right now as well. So I think we'll observe more around L1s migrating into other L1 ecosystems or becoming L2s. But I think at the end of the day, what's the most important question is like, what is the value or user problem that you're addressing? And then how do you improve accessibility or on-ramps to that, right? So today that looks like migrating into an existing ecosystem. I think further on is then how do we improve the on-ramps into that ecosystem, so you don't even have to think about what chain you're moving on, and you're just interacting with the application.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Justin. Wonder, like 7 or 8 minutes left. Maybe is there anyone else? I know Swati had some stuff in the chat and has been looking into things. Swati, did your question from earlier get answered? Let me put it up there.
I honestly am not sure. I was asking about like the future of interoperability. Is that what you're talking about, Vivek?
Yeah.
Okay. Zain, I was wondering, and maybe this isn't like the right question to ask or to end on. What do you think the future of interoperability is? Like, is it full abstraction away from the concept of bridging and to the point where like we don't to the point where users don't even know what chain they're on, and that could be best for like accessibility and getting non-Web3 people on the chain? Or is complete abstraction away not where we should head, because people should know what chain we're on, people should have some like idea of what is happening technically? And yeah, I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, Swati, great question. I think, look, this is my opinion. I think in the near term, like let's say the next year, the concept of chains are still going to be relevant, right? The reason being is there is an economic incentive for XYZ chain to say, um, to attract developers to them, right? So if block space is a commodity right now, right? You have a bunch of EVM block space and we're all competing to get an application developer on there. How does XYZ chain bring on a developer? They have to be able to communicate that, hey, XYZ chain is unique. You should come build on us because of these specific reasons. I think if you look at Web2 and like traditional markets, I think what we're starting to observe is like state is not just going to continue to replicate, right? At a certain point, there's going to be, 10 chains that are the dominant where majority of compute is happening. And I think only at that point in time, right, where there isn't this incentive to spin up a new chain, kind of bring on existing developers onto there, but where there's a set of chains that are driving a majority of distribution, and at that point in time, we can start abstracting this concept of a chain, right? So no longer does a developer have to think about which L2 I'm deploying on. They just deploy on Ethereum, and that is the ultimate goal. Personally, like I don't believe that's going to happen within the next year, even though that, like as a user, that is my hope. I just think the economic incentives will not lead to chain abstraction in the immediate term, but absolutely in the longer term. And I think in the longer term, the competitive dynamic that's going to be driving that is the developer experience that are happening on other integrated scaling solutions. So to summarize, I think in the near term, the economic incentives aren't going to drive chain abstraction, even though I want that as an end user. I think in the long term, the competitive dynamic from other scaling solutions is going to demand chain abstraction happen. Swati, did that answer your question?
That answered my question so beautifully. Thank you so much, Zain.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a great question, Swati. Yeah, I feel pretty good about where we are. I know Zain has to go in a few, and I think the conversation, if we zoomed out, it started big picture. What was this whole Ethereum thing? How did we think about it as a new type of trust space where any type of transaction could happen, compared to where other transactions on the internet have happened. And we've gotten really into the nitty gritty by the end of this call of like, what does it take to actually make that thing work as well as it possibly can, and the overall long-term like arc of that story. I think I I think there's some stuff in the chat that we'll have the next 30 minutes to get into. But I really did like Anya's point. And it's something that I've heard Zain talk about with just like trying your best. Be good is the simple thing that I saw flash across my screen. I still have a lot of chat messages to read, but um, Zain, I think, has been somebody who's done that. I've experienced it being around him. He's just trying as hard as he can, and doing that across a lot of different domains in his life. Optimism being one of them, but also if you see him on Warpcast right now, there's a little running competition that you could join with him and the base folks, and I think that do your best approach is what I'm sensing from what's going on in the optimism world. It's just like there's this whole like thing that's kind of like building a rocket that is slowly and steadily happening, um, and hopefully we'll continue just doing as best as we can, watching out for each other along the way. Zain, do you have anything else you'd like to share before you have to go?
I am so fired up. Just watching the chat, hearing the questions, it's super cool to see that people are passionate about this. Like this is open source technology. This is the future we want to build. So please keep participating. Please keep sharing your feedback. Keep focused on user problems like bridging, right? Assets not being fungible, even though effectively it is. Like being vocal and offering solutions is how, and working with other people in the ecosystem is how we bring this technology to the masses. So thank you all for the opportunity to jam. I love the Kernel program. Literally, I feel so passionate right now, seeing how how spicy the chat was. So thank you.
Thank you. Take care, Zain. And he's in Slack if you need him. Warpcast, he's findable on the interwebs. Peace. Cool. If we'd like, we can try to unwind some of the ideas in the chat. We're going to save the chat for anyone who wants to look at it later. So there will be a transcript. Saying kind of looks like Aaron Schwartz is funny. Okay. I honestly am struggling to keep up, but I wonder if, I don't know, anyone who's been keeping up with the chat would be willing to share their thoughts. We can get into the module in any way that feels appropriate. So would be happy to hear from anyone who has any thoughts on what Zain has shared or anything in the chat. Anna, please.
Hey, that was so fascinating. I feel like really out of my depth, in a really good way. It's kind of making my brain hum. But I think as like a sort of relative newbie, actually very much a newbie to this space, I think one of the kind of interesting intellectual things that I wonder about and that kind of seems to be coming through in the chat, and maybe it's just not the right question, open to that being a possibility, but like how much do people need to understand about the way things work in the background in order to like fully participate, and like how much do people need to be sort of like intellectually involved in the building of a new internet in order to be like show up in the internet? I guess is sort of the question that comes to mind when reading through the chat and kind of thinking about the conversation we just had.
I think that's really as spot on as you could have gotten, Anna, with the question. And I don't want, well, I have some thoughts on it because it's such a good question, but I'm open to anyone else's if anyone would like to add. Camila, you have your hand raised. Would love to hear from you and get just kind of open discussion for the next 20 to 30.
Yeah, no, I feel also really fired up and inspired, because this is a topic that as a designer I'm very passionate about, like mass adoption, sort of go to market, and how do we design for that? And like we were talking about earlier, like, I mean, my prediction is that when it comes to design, we have to be in design, right? In designing any experience, a big topic of consideration is how do we share the right amount of information at the right time for the right audience, right? And for the long term, my prediction is that everything we're talking about now is essentially going to be bucketed into the back end, much like how a lot of us don't know how Wi-Fi works or who really created the foundation of that, right? Or Google Maps, for example, or really the internet. So it's just exciting. I think in the short term, more conversations in spaces like this with builders and people who are very involved in the space are going to champion that. But also, I really love how we spoke a lot about trust, and not just trusting applications, but also trusting humans, because when it comes to decentralized technology, it's incredibly new, and what is going to gain the trust of humans is not applications, but fellow humans, right? In order to champion this technology. So just lots of thoughts. Very excited about where this is going, and just really feeling really blessed to be here, really.
Thank you, Camila. Anya, and then Thomas as well. Anya, please.
Hi, yo. I actually want to address what Anna said. I think it's important to be visible in a space. It's important to ask right questions and find the right people and right communities to get the answer from. And I think you totally nailed it. So just chill. And also, I feel like, for example, there's a traders community where nobody cares about tech like at all. And there's like builders who really focused on, I don't know, collective to provide like a collective good to the world, or there's builders who are there for games or whatever. So there's different communities, just explore and find whatever resonates with you. And also I'm guessing you have some kind of background, and maybe there's space in crypto where you can, you know, apply yourself, and through that you can navigate a new industry, new world. And for design, since I'm an artist and designer, and I was working as a designer since I'm like 16, I was working with books. I loved books when I was a kid. And I'm still really into books. I was creating like art book festivals and programs and so on. So the idea of like collective consciousness being documented and in real time, because with all the tooling we have right now, like Miro, whatever, HackMD, I really enjoy HackMD right now. Or even there's a new browser you can keep the tabs in one column. There's also, for example, we are so used to in Web2 to the tools like that, and we expect the same in the Web3. But the idea, to me, idea of Web3 is like this untouchable truth or source of truth. So I don't think we ever gonna get there, and I think we have to manage our expectations, like what we, you know, what we expect from Web 2, what we expect from Web 3. Maybe there's this divide is not, maybe the problem is in binary of our world, you know, different expectations and so on. And I think designers should code, and if you have some, you know, 5 minutes from your day, you should kind of invest into developer education. And it's fun, you can find tutorials online. Now it's the best way, I mean, best time to learn, because there's so many tutorials and people write in blogs how they learn different things. And there's also a lot of women and queers providing education, for example, Dapoden, for all the POC folks out here. And he's also queer and funny. He's making a dating show and people code in real time. So, I mean, there's fun ways to join the community and just vibe. So, yeah. Also very grateful to be here. It's my first time fully online, so I'm really enjoying it. Thanks.
Thanks for please send some links, Anya. Those are great. Thomas.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed the chat going in, and it's just good to also get some visibility on what's happening on the super chain given the amount of traction they've just developed. Yeah, so I'll touch on like three people's points because I really like the points they gave out. I like the way Camilla described like how much information is going to be needed in order for like users to know what they're doing, like just to show up essentially, and then participate. And then how Nicholas phrased it in the chat, he said something like you shouldn't have to turn into a nerd in order to understand how these things work. And then back to Anya, it was like manage expectations. For the longest I've always thought that because again of everything else that's around us now in terms of normal technology and software to interact with, the conception is that everything on the user side, end user side, should work like magic, right? Because you want it to be simple and you want it to be able to like run this purpose, or you want to do this transaction. It should be simple as how we've gotten acclimated to a bunch of other things that were like introduced. But now going forward, I'm at this point where something where I say like decentralization is something that needs to have, it has a requirement for some amount of like intellectual participation, because you're dealing with a new paradigm when it comes to like assets and ownership. Like ownership is the best word to use. Ownership within like of like these from both sides, digital assets to actually real world assets is the new thing that's being introduced. So like when you're dealing with something that covers all of these specific grounds, which are like new ways to interact with what we've always known, but then in a tighter sense, because it now talks about having to do identity on chain and all of these other things, and essentially the applications are getting more serious on that side. So it's like, okay, yes, it should be simple enough, because it should be simple enough that people are able to use it, right, and not be overloaded with information. But there should be, the question I think we should ask is, how much information do we need the normal end user to have in order to be able to operate on these things? Because I just believe that there is it shouldn't be easy. There's some level of difficulty that should come into decentralization, because I mean it's a really huge thing. It's just that we're seeing it in smaller scope, so it's not really easy to see everything in totality. But like decentralization from all of the systems we've known means that there should be some inherent level of difficulty in terms of usage. But then again, I do come from the dev side, so maybe that's my bias. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else have any?
Yeah, I'd like to share. Thanks everyone for a great conversation again this Thursday. I think Grace Rachmani hit it on the nail on the head in the chat, answering this question about how much tech do you actually need to know. And the reality is we see very different levels of tech needed, knowledge needed in different ecosystems. I think the big challenge right now is professional personal development for executives within the space. Back to Vivek's point and the team's point last week about ego. And back to the point last week and earlier this week about money and the role of money. And so I think it's really important, not just from a competitor standpoint, but from a curiosity standpoint, to understand how other people on other chains are approaching these problems. Near is a good example. Ilya was able to take 5 years of Ethereum's experience, like Zain was referencing with some of the other L1s, and build a different model based on that learning, right? Does it mean that Near hasn't got nearly the adoption that maybe it should? But we can learn, and we can learn from each other. And Tron has such a bad reputation. Like, I've mentioned it to a few people I know, and it's just like run far away fast. But if it's helping people in Venezuela where they don't have access to fiat because inflation has gone crazy, then like that's not a bad thing, right? And so really, Zain mentioned, like, what's the actual use case problem you're trying to solve here? That doesn't really seem to be how most developers I know are thinking. And it's interesting that he brought that up, though, as sort of the core principle from which you build, which it is important, right? You don't build a house just to experiment if you can build a house. You build a house because you need shelter. So it's been a great conversation this week, and we have a lot of people with very vast experience, which is the blessing of being able to learn together.
Yeah, I'm really grateful for that, Elizabeth, and for everyone's comments. I mean, my sense of Zain on a personal level is that he's brought to me like a different sense of professionalism in rigor, and just like trying to understand a problem, to understand it in such a way that in a conversational setting like this, he can try his best to tell the component parts that are relevant given the questions at hand, and know that he can trust the preparation that he's put into understanding each of the component parts, so that he can be a meaningful part of conversations. I think a lot of the times in crypto, we've run into people who are willing to talk without being willing to do the preparation, and that is something that is tricky at scale because it starts to cloud real learning, and so it's also something I'm grateful for from Andy, like that on a very different dimension. He's done a lot into the words like trust or value or meaning, or in next week's topic on the global financial system, we'll get into money and speech, and better questions is kind of like a big topic, because if we've gotten into complex topics in the first couple of weeks, next week's is on money, and that tends to really get people going. So I'm curious how the chat will be next week, because it'll be fun, I think, and it's an important thing to try to cultivate. If I'm hopeful for anything in Kernel, it's that we nudge each other to these types of peer-to-peer dialogues where real learning is centered, where somebody who has done the preparation helps, but that the dialogue drives the story, of like what is most relevant. So if I were to go back to Anna's question, which I really think, I don't think we could have had a better one to start off this second part, is like, how much do people need to know? I I, I think that this like style of dialogue, and to Thomas's point, like the nature of the technology is that it's peer-to-peer and participatory, and then that means that the nature of the technology perhaps is encouraging dialogue and learning. Whether we use it in that way and whether we choose to go that direction with it is up to us, but participatory, peer-to-peer, and dialogue based seem to be the bend of all of the things that are being explored here. And we're in a moment where it is the dialogue era to some degree. And so we're here and we're in an environment where there's other people thinking about it. So maybe we can use it to get into the intricacies and the nitty-gritty, knowing that, you know, in 2 years or in 5 years or in 10 years, maybe there'll be some other nitty-gritty thing that's really more important to get into, but this is just like the moment in time that we're in. And so, yeah, open to any feedback, of course, on that thought or in general on how Fireside formats are going. We want to make sure that this format type is kind of like the expansive, it brings new ideas and new learning to your experience of Kernel, and that it's balanced by your craft, really. Starting with next week's office hours, we're getting deeper and deeper into, okay, what is it that you're hoping to do for the rest of the 7 to 8 weeks of KB9? And hopefully those two modes balance off of each other. If we have anything else, please feel free. If not, we always kind of pop into the gather as like a blast scattering if anyone wants to get into smaller groups. You know, it's a big group on the call still, so it might be more comfortable to just be in smaller group tables and see where the discussions go. That is my instinct, but open to any final thoughts if anyone has anything.
Yeah, okay. I kind of want to get back to what sorry, fine, this is just gonna be a final thought and quick. What Elizabeth was saying about building, solving problems. Just for background, I went to school for computer science amongst other things, but worked as a software engineer and just finished my MBA. And I'm like a tech girl, engineer through and through. And I'll say like the biggest thing I learned in business school was learning that no one cares about the tech. It doesn't matter how cool the tech is. It's that we need to solve problems. So I really like, I feel like there's like, it's so easy to be like, it's the engineers, it's the builders. I think there are like, I think people, as I said in the chat, like they love like the exclusive nature. Like people love acting smarter than they are. So it's like, if you're not building, sorry, I'm getting a little turned around, but I think like just the fact that building and solving problems is a good way to look at it. And I think that isn't the fact that I learned it in business school and I'm like, oh, that's how you should build, and that like really opened my eyes in tech. Like I think that just goes to show that the discipline, it's like that should probably be added to the discipline of computer science.
So Swati, this is a great point. For example, when you're in law school, you don't learn how to run a practice. You don't learn anything about actually being a lawyer. right? This
Mhm.
is the problem of siloed learning overall, and why cross-functional learning is the key. And this goes back down to, you know, us versus them, like we've talked about. If it's all about just protecting what we have from people who could take it, right, it's a problem. But we know that cross-functional teams perform better. Anna could go talk ad nauseum on this, right? That's one of her specialties. So like and this is also why it's important to participate in groups like this, and why we really have to be decisive and like distilling about where we spend our intellectual energy. I'm not going to spend 5 minutes going and learning how to program, right? I have 2 kids, I have a house, I have a life, I have a family, I have parents. Like, that's just not available to me at this time, right? And so that's why, like, working in groups, right? Everybody brings their specialties together. So I'm so glad you had that experience in business school. And this is why, coming from a social services background, people-centered work, really centering your client and their needs instead of what the funder wants to fund, right? What the VC wants to fund. And we really want to build for people and not just to generate wealth for people who already have money. Like, we have to center the problem, and that has to be centered again within the people who are experiencing the problem.
Yeah.
What they think needs to happen.
Yeah.
I don't want to throw shade to developers, because like that's not how my brain works, and it's amazing to me to watch you guys work. But I do think that, like, we just haven't gotten maturity wise to the place yet where perspectives like ours are not even welcome but sought after.
Yeah, I think someone said something great in the chat. I'm so sorry that I can't think of who said it, but about how I think tech as a whole, I think they said Web3, but I think tech as a whole is seen as agnostic, or like just like it's non-political. Maybe like with all that's happening with Trump in the US and tech, maybe it's different now, but like tech is value centric. Like, we need to put our values into our technology, and like I think that's what like really it comes down to. Like, no, it's not putting values into the technology, isn't like perverting tech. Like, it's actually making the tech better. And yeah, just that aspect of it.
Yeah, I think both. Oh, go ahead, George. Sorry.
Jumping in the conversation here, because clearly this is an issue and topic that a lot of us are passionate about. And I'm super, super passionate about this. And a hill I will die on is like the vast majority of builders, whether they're developers or entrepreneurs or builders in a company, are building products that are not solving real problems. They don't understand the actual personas. They don't understand the actual problems that they're solving. And that's why I think so many products and so many startups fail. And I've done this several times before. And this is why I think actually researching things super, super deeply, going to first principles, walking the idea maze, having these dialogues are so important. Because like the worst thing all of us could do is burn 2 to 4 years of our lives solving a problem that doesn't exist. And, you know, the most valuable thing we have is our time, right? But if I take it back to Swati, what you were saying is like, I think the actual bigger thing isn't just for developers, it's for anyone that's building anything, like engineers, designers, PMs. I've played like multiple of these hats before, and I've definitely made these mistakes before. And at the same time, I think it's dramatically complicated in Web3 because the financial incentives are so out of whack. The number of like investors and VCs that have come to me and said, just why don't you launch a token? Why are you doing things the hard way and trying to actually understand the problems and personas and solve real problems? That seems like silly compared to when you could just like make a lot of money and like launch a token. That really frustrates me that that kind of mindset exists in some parts of Web3.
Yeah, 100%,
I
George.
was
I
on
agree
it.
with everything you just said.
Sorry.
And sorry, Elizabeth, I just want to get back to what you guys were talking about too, a little bit about like the culture. And I think somebody said executive leadership training needed to go into the Web3 community. I am a technical guy. I'm an engineer, and I find Web3 to be incredibly unapproachable. Like, my craft in Kernel is literally just understand Web3 more so I can participate in Web3. And I haven't found up to this point like a community that was accessible enough to really ask what I think are dumb questions and what a lot of people are like, oh yeah, it's just this, and you have to do the thing with the bridge and the chain and da 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 da. And yeah, just one anecdote on your whole like personality comments about like designers versus engineers. My brother, he went to school for a film degree. He studied film, couldn't get a job out of college. Surprise, surprise. In that economy at that time, and his buddy recommended him to a tech job, and they interviewed him and they said, "Get out of here! You have no tech background. Like, forget it." They called him back 6 months later and they said, "Look, we interviewed 10 people who are more qualified than you technically, but we couldn't hold a conversation with any of them. And so we're going to hire you and just hope that we can train you." And they did, and he's done great. And that is actually becoming more and more common. My partner does workforce economic development, and she's finding that a lot of tech companies now are interviewing on personality, working together with teams, and learning, and not just straight technical chops. And I wonder if like the Web3, what we're hearing here in this conversation, is going to start going that way as well. People that are thinking more than just like, can we build the thing? Can I do the code? And like, can I work with others? Etc. So I really just want to comment on the whole conversation. I don't really have a strong point here, but this has been an incredible conversation, and I appreciate this fireside a lot.
Yeah, Igor, please, please.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I work in workforce development or have for a long time, and like they're not training devs Web3 yet. And I keep trying to figure out like when can I get the boot camps to start teaching both sets of languages and not just Web 2, which also would help with the glut of programming jobs available in Web 3. But it's again like workforce, like the workforce development sphere is so removed from this sector. And maybe there's people here, I think Vivek, maybe you're in Austin, maybe this is different in a couple of cities. I sort of doubt it, but it would be interesting to know, because like the economic engine that run reskilling and upskilling so far have not tapped into this sector. And it's one of these things where it's like, is that a project worth pursuing? Is there a way to do that? But just that made me think of that, because you're still just looking to program for Web 2. But that's a huge sector of people who need jobs, right? We could that's another inroad that we could be pursuing
It's a
for
good, yeah.
adoption.
I think that's a really fruitful point for sure. Something to consider. I was thinking about that maybe like yesterday, actually. But Elizabeth, we can talk about it at 4-ish, 5 minutes left. Yegor, if you're willing.
Yeah, I will go. Yeah, so I wanted to touch on like this whole conversation, and then kind of like really talked so much about like how the developers should be building dApps, and that they are like being so like this hard user experience, etc. But then I think what we are like not considering in this part of conversation, that most of this user experience is actually like coming from wallets. So like how we interact with wallets, and that like the wallets on blockchain are being like the main adoption layer. Yeah, like to everyone like using it easier. And this is like also where we're going with like all of the abstraction wallets. Yeah, like what Zain was touching upon about, like Zora letting you to use to pay the fees that you have like on any chain. And then like at this point, I guess like once the wallets will become more user friendly, it doesn't really matter how developers are building their apps, and if they are just like geeks or no, like if they're going to be like better wallets with easier UX, the adoption will be common. Yeah, and this is like where we are already going. Yeah, so wanted to touch on that.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you. Mupelelo, please.
Yeah, I think I've been listening to the conversation, and it's pretty interesting how we all are seemingly diverging in a single point of let's try and simplify all of this and make it as usable as possible. I'm from South Africa. the countries that are in Africa struggle with inflation that's above 12% per annum. And I think that's probably one of the biggest problems that we can try and solve as well. How do we actually solve this problem for most living? Between India and South Africa, India and Africa, it's about 2.4, 2.5 billion people that are really in need of this. But I think I also get it. The search for liberty is also important as well. But I think from a person who comes from a third world country, it's a different conversation altogether. And if you are keen on chatting to me and building for the people that we're building for, it's chat. So bring your skills aside and bring your money aside as well.
Thank you. Thank you. And love to hear more about Nude Money and your work. Thank you for sharing. I think we may have time for one more. If Justin, you had something? If not, it's okay. And we have a poem in the chat, and I'm happy to read it. Or you could, if you'd like.
Yeah, I can read it. I was just getting the sense of like we were talking about a lot about how people work and how they think and how they operate and what motivates them, and it made me kind of feel like the importance of honoring that we live in a very differentiated and individuated and neurodiverse world. And so to understand people's motivations and where they come from and why they do what they do is a very deep process that requires a lot of learning together and a choice to journey. And this kind of quote from Rabbi Lawrence Kushner came to me, which is, it just says that it's talking about learning journeys. So it says like, this is the setting out, the leaving of everything behind, leaving the social milieu, the preconceptions, the definitions, the language, the narrow field of vision, the expectations. No longer expecting relationships, memories, words, or letters to mean what they used to mean, to be in a word open. And I just see that in this kernel journey, we're on week 1, right? And I think that all those conceptions we have about what developers are, or who they think are, or what business looks like, or even what it means to be in Web3, I feel like if we can continuously choose to be open and wide our field of vision to what the reality of this kind of cohort and in this world could be, I think it will just really serve and support you continue to support and serve this rich discussion and exploration that we're kind of all on.
Really appreciate that, Justin. Thank you so much for your sharing. And everyone, it's always like, how many voices are on Fireside is directly proportional to how good it is in my book. And really grateful for everyone adding their thoughts and being with us. We'll keep it rolling next week on global financial system. We hope that some convos could get on the calendar to explore in smaller groups, and appreciate you helping to seed this space, everybody. Still near the beginning, and we'll try our best to remain open. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, everybody, for your thoughts. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, Anna. Thank you. It was really great.
Thank you. See you soon.
Take care. Take care. Thanks, Val. Thanks, Camila. Hope you enjoyed, Felipe, Faraz. Take care. Take care. Take care. Bye, Link. Bye-bye.